Alright, yes, I know it's already February, so I'm a little bit late with this. But either way, another decade has come and gone. And, it's been a decade. We'll just say that. It certainly was a decade. And for the teams on today's episode, that's about the best you can say for the last 10 years. As today we will be going over the worst, or at least successful franchises over the last 10 years. Before we get to the honorable mentions, I do want to just quick mention that this is going to be just limited to the four major North American sports leagues, being obviously the NHL, the NFL, the MLB, and the NBA. And as far as how I measured the success of each team, I took into consideration their year-to-year win percentage, as well as whether or not they made the playoffs. And if they made the playoffs, how likely it was that they were going to do that, assuming all teams in each league started on even footing, because in some leagues it is easier to make the playoffs than in others. So for an example, an NBA team, it isn't quite as impressive if you made the playoffs as it would be if you're an MLB team. Now, each of these teams failed to make the playoffs in this last decade, and that's why they're here. But they are all each MLB teams, and while they didn't make the playoffs and some of the teams on the list did make the playoffs, as I mentioned, in baseball, it's considerably harder to make the playoffs than in some other leagues. So these teams were able to score a little bit higher because of their win percentage over the decade, even though they didn't make the postseason. So to start off the honorable mentions, we have my Seattle Mariners. And while I understand that the Mariners' lack of success streak is considerably longer at this point than any other team in baseball and almost any other team in professional sports in North America, they did at least manage to have 3 winning seasons over the last decade, which is more than can be said for most of the teams to come, as well as a win percentage of .468, which again is better than most of these teams that will be following them. Second is the Chicago White Sox, who, like the Mariners, have a, at least relative to the teams to come, fairly respectable win percentage, and also managed to have 2 winning seasons. So I guess they're at least kind of watchable for 2 years. And the final honorable mention is the San Diego Padres, who, in spite of only having 1 winning season, managed to hover more around 500 pretty consistently, which kept their win percentage up and kept them out of the bottom 10. It also meant that they didn't have the one completely unbearable season of 100 losses or more, like both the Mariners and White Sox did. It's been a rough few years for Detroit sports, but for the Pistons, it's been an entire decade of disappointment. And this is coming from a team who, during the first decade of the millennium, went to the postseason 9 times, reached the finals twice, and won a title. But the 2010s have been pretty much the polar opposite of that. In the first 6 years of the decade, the Pistons failed to finish a season having won 40% of their games even once. And in 4 of those 6 years, they didn't even reach 30 wins. So I guess you can consider the fact that they've been to the playoffs 2 of the last 4 years to be a sign of better things to come. It certainly does mean that they're the only team to have had a better second half of the decade than first in the city of Detroit. But those were the only 2 seasons during the decade that they managed to have a winning season, and as far as the 2020s go, it has not gotten off to a good start. For the Suns, the 2010s actually got off to a really good start, with a first season where they won 54 games and made it all the way to the conference finals before being knocked out by the Lakers. But it's been pretty much all downhill from there, as they had a couple of seasons where they'd finished right around 500, and actually one other good season where they'd finished with 48 wins, but narrowly missed the playoffs due to a really strong Western Conference, which had to have a little extra sting considering the Atlanta Hawks made the playoffs in the East with just 38 wins that very same season. That 48-win season, though, did seem even more impressive considering it was coming off just a 25-win season, which in and of itself seems like a really bad year, and it is, But it's even worse when you consider the fact that they still had 4 more years that were worse than that 25-win season left in them throughout the rest of the decade. As the Suns finished off the decade with 4 consecutive seasons of 24 or fewer wins for a winning percentage below 300 each year, and a final season of just 19 wins. So even with a 54 and a 48 win season in the decade, their overall win percentage was just barely over 400. And with just 1 playoff appearance and only 2 seasons above 500, it's been a pretty miserable decade to be a Suns fan. And while the Suns are still looking for their first NBA title, they have at least been competitive up until this point, going to the playoffs 18 of the 21 years preceding the 2010s. In fact, not only is this 9-year playoff drought that they're currently on almost twice the length of their franchise's previous long, the 19-win season that they finished off the decade with is second only to their inaugural season for least wins. But none of that changes the fact that these last 10 years, or at least 9 years, have been pretty abysmal for the Suns. And the only good news really for them is that it really can't get much worse. With just 305 wins over the last decade, the Oilers were the worst team in the NHL over the 2010s. And while this may come as a surprise to you if you're a new fan or just a casual fan, especially considering their talent and the fact that for the last few years they've had the best player in hockey on their team, the Oilers only managed to reach 80 points in just 1 season. And if you're not familiar with hockey, for a point of reference, it usually takes 90 to 95 wins at minimum to make the playoffs. Their 47-win 2016-2017 season, in which they had 103 points and made the playoffs, even making it to the second round before being knocked out, is really all that's saving them from being even lower on this list. But unlike a lot of other teams on this list, at least for the Oilers, the future does look bright. As I alluded to earlier, they are actually competitive this year and finally got some talent around Connor McDavid, which means they could stay very competitive and a perennial playoff team over the next few years in the Pacific. Unlike the 3 honorable mentions we had earlier from the MLB, for the Marlins, not making the playoffs in the decade wasn't good enough. They didn't even have a winning season. The 2010s started off with a nearly 500 season for the Marlins, in which they won 80 games and had 82 losses. But that's as good as the decade got for the Marlins, as they managed to lose 100 games twice, including a 105-loss 2019 season. And while their .431 winning percentage over the course of the decade was easily the worst in all of baseball, for the Marlins, the on-field problems were almost the least of their worries. And while they did get a new stadium at the start of the decade, which was sorely needed, it didn't come without an excessive amount of controversy, even for a new stadium, which is saying a lot, and also a lot of greed on the part of the owner, and I'm not going to get too much into that, but let's just say it wasn't pretty. But despite all that, in the middle of the decade, it seemed like the Marlins might actually be improving after acquiring D. Gordon from the Dodgers, and with some good young talent coming up like Jose Fernandez, Giancarlo Stanton, and Christian Yelich. Unfortunately for the Marlins, this hope was squashed over the course of just a few years, starting with the tragic passing of Jose Fernandez in a boat accident in 2016, followed by the trading of 2015 batting champion D. Gordon to the Mariners, Giancarlo Stanton going to the Yankees, and then Christian Yelich going to the Brewers, which all he did was go on to win the MVP of the National League. Over the course of the last few years, the only thing the Marlins have been able to chase away faster than talent is their own fans, as they are the only team who has now in back-to-back seasons failed to reach 1 million total attendance, barely getting over 800,000 in each year. But hey, at least Marlins fans got to see Ichiro's 3,000th hit, and also got to see him pitch, so there's that. Sadly for the Raiders, their last decade in Oakland was as much a disaster on the field as it was off of the field. The decade for them at least did start somewhat decently with back-to-back 8-8 seasons, which, while that might not sound impressive, it was coming off of 7 consecutive seasons of failing to win 6 games. Unfortunately, these 2 seasons were not the sign of improvement that many had hoped they were going to be, as they followed them up with 2 4-win seasons and then a franchise worst 3-13 2014 season. Really, other than a 2016 season in which the Raiders out of nowhere went 12-4 and made the playoffs as a wild card before getting knocked out in the first round by the Texans, the team has been bad, and the on-field product has seemed like an afterthought to the ownership group, who has been more interested in trying to get the team to Vegas, and eventually succeeded, although even that they managed to do in as about a clumsy a way as possible. Either way, though, the team did announce that they would be moving to Las Vegas and that the 2018 season would be their last in Oakland. Or at least it would have been if they had found a place to play the 2019 season like they were supposed to, which they didn't, so then they had to beg to come back and play in Oakland one more year, and then the 2019 season was their last in Oakland. Probably. Definitely, yeah. And while I will admit I am no Raiders fan, after all, I did grow up hating the Raiders, no fan base, especially one as dedicated as the Raiders fans have been, even regardless of how bad the team has been, deserves to have the team ripped away from them. Although I will say, if there is a team that can succeed in Vegas, it is one with as big a national following as the Raiders have. After all, it can't possibly go worse than the Chargers move. Remember Saxonville, the Jaguars defense that was so dominant it won them a division and took them to the doorstep of the Super Bowl, all despite having Blake Bortles at quarterback? Well, for some reason, at least to me, that seemed like it was a longer period of success, or at least more successful while it was there. In the end, though, it was just one 10-6 season, and sure, they did win a division and 2 playoff games, but when you include those 2 playoff games, that one season accounts for more than 20% of the Jaguars' wins in the entire decade. While the Jaguars' history is not necessarily one steeped in success, between their 1995 inaugural season and 2010, they had only once failed to win at least 5 games, and never failed to win at least 4. But during the last decade, they did that 3 times, with 2 3-win seasons in 2014 and 2016, and 1 2-win season in 2012. But hey, at least Minshew Mania was fun this last year, and who knows, maybe they finally have found a decent quarterback for the first time since Mark Brunell. Even if it is a 6th round draft pick and not the guy you're paying $88 million to over the course of the next 4 years. Like the Jaguars, the Bucs did have a 10-6 season, and even if you include those 2 postseason wins for the Jaguars, the Buccaneers still won 6 more games over the course of the decade. Plus, they only had 6 seasons where they lost double-digit games, something the Jaguars managed to do 8 times. Really, the biggest difference between the 2 teams is the fact that the Jaguars' 10-6 season resulted in a division title and a chance to go to the AFC Championship after winning 2 games. But for the Bucs, their 10-6 season did not result in playoffs, making them one of 2 teams in the NFL to not go to the playoffs during the entire course of the 2010s. But to be fair to the Bucs, at least their mediocre to bad quarterback play has been entertaining, between Fitzmagic and Famous Jameis's penchant for big plays, even if half of those do go to the defense. Unfortunately for the Bucs, though, it was never really complemented by a defense that could prevent all of those turnovers from turning into points. Oh, and I almost forgot their rebrand that makes them look like walking digital clocks, or maybe a calculator, although nobody wears 08, so you can't even make a funny word out of them. Alright, this might be a bit of a stretch, but just bear with me for a second. Imagine you're playing a video game from the early 2000s, like Mass Effect for example, before autosave was as reliable as it is now, and you've spent hours battling through room after room of baddies to get to the final boss, only to die, whether it is to the boss itself landing a hit or because you threw a grenade, it bounced off of a wall, and you blew yourself up. Doesn't really matter. The point is, you did all this work only to realize that you forgot to save it at any point, and now you're set back all of that time. Well, that pretty much was the entire decade for the Minnesota Timberwolves, only where the final boss is a winning season, as they started out the decade with a 15-win season, but slowly started to win more and more games each year over the next 5 years, to finally get to a season of 40 wins and 42 losses in 2004, nearly getting to 500. But then the next season they were back down to just 16 wins and had to start all over again. And although the Timberwolves did manage one winning season after 4 more years of slowly improving, and even went to the playoffs although they were knocked out in the first round, the final year of the season they fell back to 36 wins and 46 losses. And while Minnesota wasn't the only team in the NBA over the last decade who had a season where they failed to win at least 20 games, they were the only team to do it 3 times. All of which, even despite that one playoff season, adds up to the second worst win percentage of any team in the NBA over the course of the 2010s. In the end, really the only good thing to come out of this decade for the Timberwolves is the fact that that one playoff appearance did manage to end their, at that time, league-leading 13-year playoff drought. With just 287 wins over the last 10 years, the Sacramento Kings managed to barely edge out the Minnesota Timberwolves for least wins in the NBA during the course of the last decade. But while the Timberwolves got there by mixing in a couple of at least bearable seasons with a few truly awful ones, the Kings did so by being remarkably consistent, albeit consistently bad. And if for these teams the final boss was a winning record, it took the Kings until the final season to even find the room the boss was in, as they only twice managed to win at least 40% of their games. The first season of which didn't even come until the 2015-2016 season. Plus, in addition to all the failure on the court, the Kings dealt with a couple of years of rumors of relocation and a potential move to Seattle that was eventually blocked by league decision makers who finally decided to grow a spine. And while this newly realized backbone did come a few years too late for Seattle, who should very well still have a team, I personally, as a Seattle fan, am glad that our team doesn't come back at the expense of another fan base. But back to the success of the Kings, at least for them, their last season of the decade was also their best season, so maybe that's a sign of improvement. I wouldn't count on it, but here's hoping. Oh, the Browns. Honestly, I feel bad for Browns fans. There isn't a fan base that is as dedicated to a team that is as truly bad as the Browns have been. Even despite having easily the worst winning percentage of any team in any league, Browns still managed to draw at somewhere around the middle of the pack amongst all teams in the NFL. For a point of reference to just how bad the Browns have been, between the 4 leagues, the Kings had the second worst winning percentage, winning just under 36% of their games. Meanwhile, the Browns won just 26.6% of their games. And while it can be tricky to compare the season-to-season success of an NFL team to the other leagues, as they only play 16 games compared to 82, or in the case of baseball, 162, over the course of the last decade, the Browns played 160 games, in which they went 42, 117, and 1, which would make them one of the 5 worst baseball teams of all time. In the decade, the Browns were one of just 3 NFL teams to lose 100 or more games, and one of 2 teams to have 8 seasons where they had double digits in the loss column. And as far as all of sports are concerned, they were one of just 7 teams to not make the playoffs, and one of 3 teams to never have a winning record. In the middle of this terrible decade of Browns football, though, is a 3-year stretch that is so historically bad, I don't think it's a stretch to say we will never see anything quite like it again. And if you're an NFL fan who concerns yourself with your team's record in the preseason, let this be a bit of a warning sign to you. Going into the 2017 preseason, the Browns were coming off of 2 years where they had won 3 games and then just 1 game in 2016. So there wasn't necessarily a lot of hope going in. But then the Browns won all 4 preseason games. And while people weren't necessarily talking Super Bowl or even playoffs, there was at least hope that this team was going to be competitive and fun to watch week to week. But unfortunately, the Browns didn't win another game until the following preseason. Meaning that after an 0-16 season, the Browns had won as many games in that one preseason as they did over a 3-year span of regular season games. The 2017 season made the Browns one of just 3 teams in NFL history to have a winless regular season, and one of just 2 to go 0-16. But at least they got a parade out of it, because if they're not going to be entertained by the team on the field, damn it if Browns fans aren't going to find a way to entertain themselves. Somehow though, coming off of a winless season and just 4 wins in the previous 3 years, the 2018 Browns managed to win 7 games, mostly behind a rookie quarterback who, although he did have his rookie moments, showed a lot of promise and ability, plus a rookie running back who looked like one of the next best running backs in the league. And then, in the following offseason, the Browns added to an improving defensive line, as well as picking up 2 of the most talented receivers in the NFL in Jarvis Landry and Odell Beckham Jr. So when people were talking Super Bowl, or at least playoffs and division title, it didn't seem too far-fetched. However, then they only managed to win 6 games. But while Baker Mayfield didn't necessarily show the signs of improvement that you would like to see in the second year for a quarterback, it does seem at least still that the Browns have a consistent quarterback, which for them is saying quite a lot. If you're wondering how quarterbacks like Kirk Cousins and Nick Foles, or for that matter Brock Osweiler, get such big contracts after just partial seasons where they show lots of promise, look no farther than the Browns' history. Because even despite a slightly disappointing second season from Baker Mayfield, he did manage to start all 16 games of 2019, which made him the first Browns quarterback to start a full season since Tim Couch in 2001. And if he starts every game of next year, which doesn't seem too far-fetched, he'll become the first Browns quarterback to do so in back-to-back years since Brian Sipe did 4 straight seasons in 1978 to 1981. This has been a decade to forget for all of the teams on this list, to say the very least. But especially for the Browns, I hope they can do just that, because history is going to remember this as one of, if not the worst decade for any team in the entire history of sports. Alright, well, once again, thank you for joining me for my list of the 10 worst franchises in North American sports over the last decade. As always, if you like this video, there's a button for that. If you really liked it and want to see more of these, there's a button for that as well. And if you have any teams you want to add to this list, or you're a fan of one of these teams and need to vent, I totally understand, and there's a whole section down there where you can do that to any length. With that all said, thank you, and I'll see you next time. Peace.